Poor boy rescues baby in flood. What happens next will leave you speechless. Imagine a humble boy risking everything to face the raging waters of a flood and save an innocent life. Elijah, only 12 years old, jumps into a violent stream to rescue a baby trapped in the current. But what begins as a single act of bravery unfolds into a story of unexpected connections and life-changing transformations. How can someone with so little profoundly impact the lives of so many? And how far can gratitude and kindness truly take us? This is yet another heartfelt story from Living Narratives, where you feel the true emotion of stories that make you reflect on life. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and join us on this unforgettable journey. Elijah's bare feet pressed into the damp soil as he stood at the edge of the stream, his reflection rippling in the current. The early morning sun kissed the water's surface, casting fleeting glimmers of light that danced across his face. His fishing pole, patched together with tape and twine, rested in his hand. It wasn't much, but it was enough to pull dinner from the water for him and his grandmother. Martha had raised him since he was a toddler, her wiry strength and quiet wisdom shaping him into a boy far older in spirit than his 12 years. Elijah, don't forget to bring back enough for supper. Martha's voice echoed from the porch of their modest wooden home, perched on the outskirts of the small rural community. He waved back with a grin, her voice always grounding him no matter how far his mind wandered. The stream had always been his sanctuary. It was a place where he could dream without limits, far from the whispers of the townsfolk who pitied the poor boy with no parents. Elijah didn't need their pity. He had Martha, and he had his dreams. Dreams of building something better, something beyond the faded clapboard houses and narrow winding paths of his village. As the current flowed past him, Elijah imagined what lay beyond its curves and bends. He dreamed of cities with towering buildings, libraries filled with books he'd never seen, and opportunities that felt as distant as the stars. One day, he whispered to himself, tightening his grip on the pole. One day, I'll see it all. The fish weren't biting that morning, but Elijah didn't mind. Instead, he leaned forward, his reflection mingling with the shifting waters. For a moment, he saw more than himself. He saw his parents, their faces blurry in the memory but still comforting. His mother had always told him he was destined for something great. He clung to those words, even when the ache of their absence threatened to hollow him out. A sudden noise shattered his thoughts. A branch snapped nearby, and Elijah straightened, his heart quickening. He scanned the tree line, expecting a deer or perhaps a stray dog. Instead, it was the sound of rushing water that caught his attention. The stream's steady flow had grown louder, more insistent. Elijah's eyes narrowed as he stepped closer to the bank, the current now churning with an unusual ferocity. Must have been the storm last night, he muttered, recalling the pounding rain and howling winds that had kept him awake. The stream, usually calm and clear, was now murky and swollen, carrying bits of debris, branches, leaves, and scraps of things that didn't belong in the water. He watched as a plastic bottle spun wildly before, disappearing around a bend. As he turned to leave, a faint sound froze him in place. It was faint, almost swallowed by the roar of the water. But it was there, a cry, high-pitched, desperate, and unmistakably human. Elijah's heart lurched as he whipped his head toward the sound, his eyes scanning the water. "Hello," he called out, his voice wavering with urgency. There was no response, just the relentless rush of the stream. But the cry came again, sharper this time. Elijah dropped his fishing pole and ran along the bank, his eyes darting between the water and the surrounding brush. And then he saw it. A flash of color caught in the current, tangled in a mass of branches and debris. His breath caught in his throat as he realized what it was. A baby carrier, precariously balanced against the pull of the stream. Inside, a tiny figure squirmed, its cries barely audible over the roar of the water. Elijah's mind raced. He didn't think about the danger or the strength of the current. All he saw was the baby, helpless and alone. Kicking off his sandals, he plunged into the stream, the icy water stealing his breath. The current was stronger than he anticipated, tugging at him with unrelenting force. But Elijah pushed forward, his arms slicing through the water as he fought to reach the carrier. "Hold on!" he shouted, though he wasn't sure if the baby could hear him. Each step was a battle, the rocks beneath his feet shifting and threatening to send him sprawling. His fingers grazed the edge of the carrier, but the current yanked it away. Panic surged in his chest as he lunged, gripping the handle with both hands. The baby's cries grew louder as Elijah pulled the carrier close, shielding it with his body as the water pushed against him. He turned, the shore feeling impossibly far away. His legs burned as he pushed through the current, every step an act of sheer will. When he finally reached the bank, he collapsed onto the muddy ground, the carrier clutched tightly in his arms. His chest heaved as he gasped for air, the baby's cries now a lifeline grounding him. In the moment, trembling, he unfastened the carrier's straps, his hands shaking as he lifted the baby into his arms. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice raw. "You're safe now." The baby's cries softened, its tiny fists curling against Elijah's chest. He held the child close, his own tears mixing with the water dripping from his face. For a moment, the world around him faded, and all that mattered was the fragile life in his arms. Elijah looked up toward the horizon, the weight of the moment settling over him. He didn't know where the baby had come from, or what had happened to its family. All he knew was that his life, and perhaps the life of the child, had just changed forever. As he rose to his feet, the baby still cradled against him, Elijah felt a strange sense of resolve. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: this was only the beginning. Elijah's heart raced as he carried the baby up the muddy bank, his clothes drenched and clinging to his small frame. The sharp cries of the infant echoed in his ears, cutting through the rhythmic roar of the swollen stream behind him. The baby, still trembling, gripped his shirt with tiny fingers, a silent plea for comfort that Elijah felt deep in his chest. His mind reeled as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. Where had the baby come from? How had it survived the violent current? His legs wobbled with exhaustion, but he pressed forward, the weight of the child in his arms more grounding than burdensome. The path to his house was uneven, littered with debris from the storm. The sky was still heavy with grey clouds, as if the world hadn't yet recovered from the chaos of the night before. Elijah tightened his grip on the baby, whispering soothing words as he stumbled toward the wooden house he called home. "Grandma!" he shouted as the small structure came into view. Smoke curled from the chimney, a sign that Martha was up and likely preparing their morning tea. "Grandma, come quick!" Martha appeared in the doorway, her face etched with worry as she saw her grandson, running toward her, soaked to the bone and cradling something in his arms. "Elijah, what in God's name—" Her voice caught as she stepped closer and saw the baby. She gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Where did you find that child?" "In the stream," Elijah panted, setting the baby down gently, on the old wooden table in the kitchen. "It was caught in the current. I couldn't just leave it there." Martha moved with urgency, wrapping the baby in a soft towel and pressing her hand to its forehead. "It's freezing," she muttered, her voice thick with both fear and determination. She lit the small stove, warming water as Elijah watched, his arms still trembling from the effort of the rescue. The baby's cries softened under Martha's gentle touch, its eyes blinking up at her as she whispered words of comfort. "Who does it belong to?" Elijah asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The gravity of the situation was sinking in, and he felt a lump forming in his throat. "What if they're looking for it?" Martha shook her head, her brow furrowed. "I don't know, Elijah, but a storm like that, Lord help us, it could have come from anywhere." She paused, glancing at the boy. "You did a brave thing saving this little one, but we need to find out who it belongs to." Elijah nodded, though his stomach churned with unease. He couldn't explain the attachment he already felt to the baby, whose tiny fingers now clung to the edge of the towel as if holding on for dear life. He didn't even know its name, but something about the child's presence felt profound, as though their lives were now inexplicably intertwined. The sound of heavy boots on the porch startled them both. Martha's eyes widened as the door swung open to reveal a neighbor, Mr. Collins, his face grim. "Martha, Elijah," he said, his voice rough. "You'll want to hear this." "What is it?" Martha asked, clutching the baby closer. "There's word going around," Collins said, stepping inside and lowering his voice. "A baby's gone missing. Belongs to the Hayes family. You know, the ones with that big estate on the other. East side of town. They're saying the flood took it. The whole town's looking." Elijah's breath caught. "The Hayes?" he echoed, glancing at the baby. He'd heard of the Hayes family before. Everyone had. They were wealthy, powerful, and as far removed from Elijah's world as the moon was from the earth. Collins nodded. "The sheriff's organizing a search. They're assuming the worst, but—" His voice trailed off as his eyes fell on the baby in Martha's arms. "Is that—" Elijah stepped protectively in front of the table, his heart pounding. "I found it in the stream," he blurted out. "It was going to drown." Collins stared at the baby, his expression softening. "Well, I'll be. You saved it." He shook his head in disbelief. "The Hayes will want to know about this. I'll send word to the sheriff." Martha hesitated, glancing between Elijah and Collins. "Do you think they'll come here?" "They'll have." "Unto," Collins replied. "This is their child, Martha, and they'll be grateful to know it's alive." Grateful. The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken doubt. Elijah had no illusions about how the Hayes might view someone like him. A boy from the poorest part of town, with nothing to his name but his courage and his dreams. Would they see him as a hero, or would they look down on him, questioning his intentions? The thought made his chest tighten. As Collins left to alert the authorities, Elijah sat by the table, watching the baby sleep in Martha's arms. Its tiny chest rose and fell with each breath, a reminder of how fragile life could be. He couldn't help but wonder what would happen when the Hayes arrived. Would they take the baby and leave without a second thought? Or would this moment, this act of courage, change everything? For now, all he could do was wait. The sound of the stream still echoed in his mind, a constant reminder of how close the baby had come to being lost forever. And as the storm clouds began to part, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The knock on the door came sooner than Elijah expected. It was firm and purposeful, the kind of knock that demanded attention. He glanced at Martha, who had just finished swaddling the baby in a fresh blanket. She gave him a steady nod, though her hands trembled slightly as she walked to the door. When Martha opened it, two figures stood on the porch. Sheriff Evans, his hat tilted slightly from the wind, and a man in a pressed suit, his posture rigid and his expression unreadable. Behind them, a sleek black car sat parked along the dirt road, its presence starkly out of place in the humble surroundings. Elijah's heart thudded in his chest as his eyes darted between the two men. "Martha," the sheriff greeted, his voice heavy with relief. "We got word from Collins that you might have found the Hayes baby." Martha stepped aside, revealing the small bundle cradled in her arms. The suited man's composure broke for just a moment as his eyes landed on the baby. He stepped forward, his voice catching. "That's him. That's Ethan." Elijah stood frozen, his hands clenched at his sides. So the baby had a name, Ethan. It felt strange to attach a name to the fragile life he had pulled from the raging current just hours before. The man reached out as if to take Ethan, but Martha held her ground. "He's safe," she said firmly, but he was near frozen when Elijah found him. "He's been through a lot." The man's gaze shifted to Elijah, his sharp features softening slightly. "You're the boy who—" "Saved him?" he asked, his tone more curious than accusatory. Elijah nodded, unsure what to say. The sheriff stepped in, his voice warm but firm. This young man risked his life to pull Ethan from the stream. If it weren't for him, we'd be looking at a very different outcome. The man in the suit extended his hand. I'm Henry Hayes. Ethan is my son. His grip was firm but brief, as if he wasn't quite sure how to interact with someone like Elijah. Thank you, truly. You've done more for my family than I could ever repay. Elijah mumbled a quiet, "You're welcome," his eyes darting to the baby, who stirred slightly in Martha's arms. He couldn't explain it, but he felt a strange protectiveness over Ethan, as though saving him had forged an unspoken bond between them. Henry turned back to the sheriff. "I need to take him home. Grace, my wife, she's been beside herself." Martha hesitated, glancing at Elijah before carefully handing Ethan over to his father. The baby whimpered softly, but settled quickly in Henry's arms. The man looked down at his son, his expression a mix of relief and something deeper, fear perhaps, or gratitude too overwhelming to express. "We'll be in touch," the sheriff said, tipping his hat to Martha and Elijah. "You've done a good thing here, both of you." As the door closed behind them, the house felt impossibly quiet. Elijah sat down heavily at the kitchen table, staring at the spot where Ethan had just been. Martha placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You did everything you could," she said softly. "He's with his family now." Elijah nodded, but a strange hollowness had settled in his chest. He had saved Ethan, but the moment felt unfinished, as though something larger was still unfolding. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, and the world outside their home turned to shadows, a car pulled up to the house once more. This time it was only Henry Hayes who stepped out, his figure silhouetted against the glow of the car's headlights. Elijah and Martha exchanged puzzled looks before Martha opened the door. "I hope I'm not intruding," Henry began, his voice measured, "but my wife insisted I come back to thank you properly." From behind his back, he produced a neatly wrapped package. It wasn't large, but the crisp paper and perfect bow made it clear it was something expensive. "This is just a token of our gratitude," he said, handing it to Elijah. "We owe you more than we can say." Elijah hesitated, his hands lingering over the package before he finally took it. "Thank you, sir," he said quietly, though he wasn't sure what else to say. Henry lingered for a moment, his eyes scanning the modest interior of the house. "You're a brave young man," he said finally, "and I can see that you've been raised well." With that, he turned and left, the hum of his car fading into the night as quickly as it had arrived. Elijah set the package on the table, staring at it as though it might reveal some hidden truth about the day's events. When he finally unwrapped it, he found a sleek, leather-bound journal inside. Tucked into the first page was a note, written in neat, precise handwriting. "Bravery like yours is rare. Use this to record your dreams. The world needs people like you, Grace Hayes." Elijah traced his fingers over the words, his chest tightening with emotion. He had never received something so thoughtful, so personal, from a stranger. Yet it wasn't just the gift that moved him. It was the sense that his life was beginning to intersect with something much larger than himself. As he climbed into bed that night, the journal tucked safely under his pillow, Elijah felt the weight of the day settle over him. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't dared to feel before: hope. The next morning, Elijah awoke to the golden glow of sunlight streaming through the cracks in the wooden shutters of his small room. He reached beneath his pillow and pulled out the leather-bound journal, its smooth cover almost foreign against his calloused hands. The note from Grace Hayes was still tucked inside, her elegant handwriting a reminder of the strange events that had upended his world. He hadn't written anything yet. What would he even say? As he walked into the kitchen, the aroma of fried eggs and cornbread greeted him. Martha was at the stove, humming softly to herself, her movements brisk and purposeful. The quiet rhythm of their morning felt almost normal. Almost. The events of the previous day lingered like a shadow, and Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that his life had shifted in ways he didn't yet understand. Before he could sit down to eat, a knock at the door startled them both. This time it was softer, hesitant. Martha exchanged a wary glance with Elijah before wiping her hands on her apron and opening the door. Standing on the porch was Grace Hayes, her delicate frame wrapped in a pale blue coat. She looked entirely out of place against the rustic backdrop of their home, like a painting hung on the wrong wall. "Mrs. Hayes," Martha greeted, her tone polite but cautious. "What brings you here?" Grace smiled faintly, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. "I hope I'm not intruding. I had to come. May I speak with Elijah?" Martha stepped aside, her gaze flickering to Elijah. He stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing. Why would someone like her want to talk to him? Taking a deep breath, he walked to the door, his heart pounding. "Ma'am," he said, his voice quiet but steady. Grace studied him for a moment, her eyes kind, but filled with an emotion he couldn't quite place. "Elijah," she began, her voice soft, "I wanted to thank you again for what you did. I know Henry came by last night, but I needed to see you myself. You didn't just save Ethan's life, you saved our family." Elijah shifted uncomfortably under her gaze, unsure how to respond. "I just did what anyone would have done," he mumbled, looking down at his worn shoes. Grace shook her head. "No, Elijah, what you did was extraordinary." She paused, glancing back at the sleek black car parked along the dirt road. "I was hoping, well, if it's all right with Fitz, your grandmother, I'd like to invite you to our home. Ethan's still recovering, and I think it would mean a lot for him to see you." Martha folded her arms, her expression unreadable. "That's a kind offer, Mrs. Hayes. But why do you want Elijah there?" Grace hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "Because I believe he's special, and because we owe him more than gratitude." Elijah looked at Martha, his eyes questioning. She studied him for a long moment before sighing. "If that's what Elijah wants, then it's fine by me." The car ride to the Hayes estate was surreal. Elijah had never been in a vehicle so polished, so pristine. Grace sat beside him in the back seat, her demeanor warm but reserved. She asked him about his life, his family, his dreams, and though he answered honestly, he couldn't help but feel like his words were inadequate. How could someone like her understand his world? When they arrived, the estate loomed before them like something out of a storybook. The sprawling lawn, the towering columns, the glistening windows. It was a world Elijah had only seen in movies. Grace led him inside, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. The interior was even more overwhelming, with chandeliers that sparkled like diamonds and artwork that seemed older than the town itself. "This way," Grace said gently, guiding him toward a sunlit sitting room. There, on a plush sofa, sat Ethan, bundled in a soft blanket. His wide eyes lit up when he saw Elijah, and he let out a small, excited coo. Elijah approached hesitantly, his heart swelling at the sight of the baby he had risked everything to save. He crouched beside the sofa, a smile breaking across his face. "Hey there, little guy," he said softly. Ethan reached out, his tiny fingers brushing against Elijah's hand. Grace watched the interaction with tears glistening in her eyes. "He remembers you," she said, her voice trembling. "I think he knows." Before Elijah could respond, another figure entered the room. Henry Hayes stood in the doorway, his presence commanding but not unkind. His gaze landed on Elijah, and for a moment the air grew heavy. Then, to Elijah's surprise, Henry stepped forward and extended his hand. "Elijah," he said, his tone formal but sincere, "I want to apologize for how I acted yesterday. I was overwhelmed. But Grace is right. You're the reason. Our son is alive, and for that we'll always be grateful." Elijah shook his hand, his own grip firm despite the unease simmering in his chest. "Thank you, sir," he said simply. Henry nodded, his expression softening. "You're welcome here any time. If there's ever anything you need, you just let us know." As the afternoon wore on, Elijah found himself drawn into the Hayes world. Grace showed him the library, a room lined with shelves that stretched to the ceiling. "You can borrow any book you'd like," she offered, her smile genuine. Elijah's eyes widened as he scanned the titles, his fingers grazing the spines. He had never seen so many books in one place. By the time Grace drove him home, the sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the landscape. Elijah sat quietly, the events of the day swirling in his mind. He had stepped into a world so different from his own, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that he belonged there, even if just for a moment. As he climbed out of the car and thanked Grace, she placed a hand on his shoulder. "Elijah," she said, her voice earnest, "you have a good heart. Don't ever lose that." He nodded, watching as the car disappeared down the road. That night, as he lay in bed with the leather-bound journal on his chest, Elijah felt a spark of something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't just hope, it was possibility. The next morning, the small town was abuzz with the tale of Elijah's bravery. Whispers echoed in the local market, in the narrow streets, and even on the steps of the tiny church. "Did you hear what that boy did? Imagine risking his life for a stranger's baby. He's just a child himself." The admiration was evident in some voices, but in others there was something else, a hint of suspicion, even malice. Elijah walked through town with his head low, his mind racing with the events of the previous day. He had always been invisible in this place, just another boy from the poor side of town, unnoticed and unremarkable. But now people were looking at him differently. Some smiled warmly and nodded, while others crossed their arms and whispered to each other as he passed by. When he reached the small general store to buy flour for his grandmother, he felt the weight of eyes on him. The storekeeper, Mr. Sims, greeted him with a wide grin. "Elijah, you're the town hero, boy. That was a mighty brave thing you did, saving that baby." Elijah mumbled a quiet, "Thank you," his cheeks burning. But as he stepped out of the store, clutching the small sack of flour, he overheard a conversation between two women nearby. "Do you really believe he just happened to find the baby?" one woman said, her tone sharp. "What are you suggesting?" the other asked, her voice hushed but laced with curiosity. "I'm just saying, boys like him don't usually stumble into situations like that. Maybe he had something to do with it." Elijah froze, his heart sinking. He turned away quickly, hurrying back toward home. The sack of flour felt heavier with each step, as if the weight of their words had seeped into it. Back at the house, Martha was tending to the small vegetable garden behind. Their home. She looked up when she saw Elijah approaching and immediately noticed the tension in his face. "What's wrong, Elijah?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron. He hesitated, unsure of how to explain the gnawing feeling inside him. "It's nothing," he said quietly, placing the flour on the kitchen table. But Martha knew better. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip firm yet comforting. "You've got a good heart, Elijah. People will always have something to say, especially when they see someone shine brighter than they expect. Don't let them dim your light," she said. Her words soothed him, but they couldn't erase the unease. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, a knock at the door startled them both. Martha opened it to find Grace Hayes standing there once more, her expression apologetic. "Mrs. Hayes." Martha greeted her, stepping aside to let her in. Grace entered, clutching a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I wanted to bring this for Elijah," she said, glancing at the boy who stood near the kitchen table, his gaze curious but wary. "It's just a little something to say thank you." Elijah opened the package slowly, revealing a leather-bound book with gilded edges. On the cover, the title glimmered in the soft light. "Courage and Kindness, Stories that Inspire." "I thought you might like it," Grace said with a smile. "The stories in there remind me of you." Elijah ran his fingers over the cover, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you, Mom," he said softly. But before Grace could leave, there was another knock at the door. This time it was Sheriff Parker, a tall man with a gruff demeanor but kind eyes. He stepped inside, tipping his hat to Martha and Grace. "Evening," he said, his gaze settling on Elijah. I just wanted to check in. Some folks in town have been talking, asking questions about how you found the baby. Thought I'd come straight to the source." Elijah's stomach twisted. He looked at Martha, who gave him an encouraging nod. Taking a deep breath, he recounted the events of that day, the storm, the rushing waters, the faint cry, and the desperate struggle to save the baby. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled as he spoke. The sheriff listened carefully, his expression unreadable. When Elijah finished, there was a long silence. Finally, Sheriff Parker nodded. "Sounds to me like you're a brave young man," he said. "Don't pay any mind to the gossip. People around here, they don't always know how to handle a story like yours." Grace stepped forward, her voice firm. "Sheriff, I want to make it clear that my family owes Elijah everything. He's a hero, and I won't stand for anyone trying to tarnish that." The sheriff tipped his hat again. "Understood, ma'am. I'll do what I can to quiet the rumors." After the sheriff left, Grace turned to Elijah. "You've done something incredible, Elijah. Don't let anyone take that away from you." That night, as Elijah lay in bed, the leather-bound book resting on his chest, he thought about the whispers, the judgment, and the moments of kindness that had followed. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing: he wouldn't let the doubts of others define him. The current of the Riacho had tried to pull him under, but he had fought it, and he would continue to fight, no matter what came next. The days following the sheriff's visit were a whirlwind of emotions for Elijah. Whispers continued to weave through the community like an unseen current, but the voices of support began to rise above the doubt. One sunny afternoon, as Elijah helped Martha hang laundry in the yard, a sleek black car pulled up outside their modest home. The sight of it was so out of place that Elijah paused, a clothespin still in his hand. Out of the car stepped Grace Hayes, her elegant demeanor contrasting sharply with the dusty surroundings. She carried herself with purpose, but there was warmth in her eyes as she approached the gate. "Good afternoon," she called, her voice carrying over the quiet hum of the countryside. Martha wiped her hands on her apron and stepped forward, her expression a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Mrs. Hayes," she said, "what brings you here?" Grace smiled, glancing at Elijah, who stood frozen near the clothesline. "I wanted to speak to both of you. My family has been discussing how we can properly thank Elijah for what he did. We were hoping he might come visit us at our home, just for a day. We'd like to show him our gratitude in person." Elijah's eyes widened. The idea of stepping into the Hayes mansion was both thrilling and terrifying. He glanced at Martha, searching her face for guidance. Her brow furrowed slightly, but after a moment she nodded. "It's your decision, Elijah," she said gently. I'd like to go," he stammered, his heart pounding at the thought. Grace's smile broadened. "Wonderful. We can pick you up tomorrow morning, if that works for you." And so, the following day, Elijah found himself seated in the back of the black car, his hands gripping the edge of the leather seat. The ride to the Hayes estate felt surreal. As the car wound its way through manicured gardens and up a long driveway, Elijah caught his first glimpse of the sprawling mansion. It was grander than anything he'd ever imagined, its white stone walls gleaming in the sunlight and its windows glinting like jewels. Grace greeted him at the entrance, her son, Ethan, cradled in her arms. "Come in, Elijah," she said warmly. "Make yourself at home." The interior of the mansion was even more breathtaking than the exterior. Chandeliers sparkled overhead, and the floors were so polished that Elijah could see his reflection in them. But despite the grandeur, there was an emptiness to the space that he couldn't ignore. The house was quiet, too quiet for a place meant to hold a family. Grace led him to the sitting room, where Ethan gurgled happily in her lap. "Elijah," she began, her tone earnest, "we wanted you to know how much we appreciate what you did. For our son, you risked everything for a child you didn't even know. That kind of bravery is rare." Elijah shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I just did what I thought was right," he said quietly. As the day went on, Elijah was given a tour of the estate. He marveled at the library with its towering shelves of books, the indoor pool that shimmered like a jewel, and the sprawling gardens filled with flowers he couldn't name. But it wasn't the luxuries that caught his attention. It was the loneliness that seemed to linger in the air. When they reached the nursery, Grace placed Ethan in his crib and turned to Elijah. "I hope you know you'll always be welcome here," she said. "You've become a part of our story now." Just as Elijah was beginning to feel at ease, Henry Hayes entered the room. His presence was commanding, his tailored suit immaculate. He studied Elijah with a cool, assessing gaze, and for a moment the boy felt small under the weight of it. "So you're the boy who saved my son," Henry said, his tone neutral. "Yes, sir," Elijah replied, his voice steady despite his nerves. Henry's eyes narrowed slightly. "I've been hearing a lot about you, Elijah. Some say you're a hero. Others, well, let's just say not everyone is convinced." "Henry," Grace interjected, her voice sharp with disapproval. "Elijah is our guest." But Elijah, though intimidated, stood his ground. "I didn't save Ethan to prove anything to anyone," he said, meeting Henry's gaze. "I just wanted to help." For a moment, Henry said nothing. Then, to Elijah's surprise, a faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Honest answer," he said. "I respect that." As the afternoon turned to evening, the Hayes family invited Elijah to stay for dinner. The meal was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. Crystal glasses, silver cutlery, and dishes that looked like they belonged in a magazine. But despite the finery, the conversation was light and warm, led mostly by Grace, who seemed determined to make Elijah feel at ease. When it was time to leave, Grace walked Elijah to the car. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I hope this won't be the last time we see you." Elijah nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "Thank you, Mrs. Hayes, for everything." As the car pulled away from the estate, Elijah gazed out the window, his thoughts swirling. The Hayes family had shown him kindness, but there was something deeper at play, something unspoken that he couldn't quite put into words. He felt as though he had stepped into a world that was both dazzling and complicated, and he couldn't shake the feeling that his journey with them was only just beginning. As days passed, the story of Elijah's visit to the Hayes mansion spread across the town, and with it a mixture of admiration and skepticism. For Elijah, the visit had been surreal, but the feeling of being out of place lingered. Grace's kindness had been genuine, but Henry Hayes was a different matter entirely. His cool, calculating gaze had left an impression on Elijah, one that felt as much a challenge as a warning. The opportunity to cross paths with the Hayes family came sooner than Elijah expected. One late afternoon, as Elijah returned from the market with a basket of fresh produce, a black car pulled up alongside him on the dusty road. The window rolled down to reveal Henry Hayes, his expression unreadable. "Get in," Henry said, his tone more of an instruction than an invitation. Elijah hesitated, his instincts telling him to stay away, but something in Henry's gaze urged him to face whatever lay ahead. With a deep breath, he climbed into the passenger seat. The ride was silent at first, the hum of the engine the only sound. Henry finally broke the silence. "Grace believes in you," he said, his words heavy. "She thinks you're some kind of saintly boy, selfless and brave. But I've seen the world, Elijah, and it's not as kind as you think. People always have an angle." Elijah bristled at the implication. "I don't want anything from your family, Mr. Hayes," he said, his voice firm. "I just wanted to save Ethan." Henry's eyes flicked toward him, briefly surprised by the boy's directness. "Maybe you mean that, or maybe you don't even know what you want yet. But let me make one thing clear. My family's safety is my priority, and I won't let anyone disrupt that." The car stopped abruptly outside the community center, a modest building that served as a hub for the town's gatherings. Henry gestured toward it. "I've heard you come here sometimes. Show me." Elijah's confusion turned to determination. He stepped out of the car, leading Henry into the building. Inside, children played with worn-out toys, and a few women sat knitting while sharing stories. The Space was filled with a warmth that belied its humble condition. "This is where I come when I'm not helping my grandmother," Elijah explained. "I help fix the toys or teach the younger kids to read when I can. It's not much, but it's important to us." Henry's gaze swept over the room, his expression softening slightly. "You do this on your own time?" Elijah nodded. "I know what it's like to grow up without much. If I can help, why wouldn't I?" For a moment, Henry said nothing. The chatter of the children and the clatter of mismatched toys filled the silence. Then he turned to Elijah, his tone less sharp than before. "You remind me of someone I used to know, someone who thought they could change the world. Is that such a bad thing?" Elijah asked, meeting Henry's eyes with quiet defiance. Henry's lips pressed into a thin line. "No," he admitted, "but it's a hard path, and it doesn't always lead where you think it will." As they returned to the car, Henry remained pensive. The ride back to Elijah's house was quieter than before, but the tension between them had shifted. When they arrived, Henry spoke again, his voice measured. "You're a good kid, Elijah, but good isn't always enough. If you want to make a difference, you need to be smart about it." Elijah didn't respond immediately. As he stepped out of the car, he turned back to face Henry. "Maybe being good isn't enough," he said, "but it's a start." Henry watched him go, a flicker of respect in his eyes. As Elijah walked toward his house, he felt a strange sense of accomplishment. He hadn't changed Henry's mind entirely, but he had planted a seed, one that he hoped would grow. That evening, as Elijah recounted the day's events to Martha, she listened with quiet pride. "You've got a way of seeing the best in people, Elijah," she said, "even when they don't deserve it." Elijah shrugged, a small smile on his face. "I just think everyone deserves a chance," he said. In the grand Hayes mansion, Henry sat in his study, a glass of whiskey in hand. His mind replayed the boy's words, his conviction. For the first time in years, Henry felt the stirrings of doubt about his own beliefs. Perhaps Elijah wasn't just a boy who had stumbled into their lives. Perhaps he was a reminder of the person Henry had once been, and the person he still had the chance to become. The sun was setting over the small community, casting an orange glow across the fields and the meandering creek. Elijah sat outside his home, a worn notebook resting on his lap. He had always used this notebook as a place for his thoughts, sketches and ideas, his private world, where his dreams felt safe. But tonight, as he scribbled lines and erased others, his thoughts were heavier than usual. Grace Hayes had arrived that afternoon with Ethan, her cheerful laughter filling the small yard as she played with the baby. Her visits had become more frequent, and with each one, Elijah felt a growing bond between them. She seemed genuinely interested in his life and often asked questions that made him think about his future in ways he never had before. "Elijah," she had said earlier that day, her voice calm yet encouraging, "what do you dream about? If you could change one thing about your life or the world, what would it be?" The question had caught him off guard. No one had ever asked him that. He had always kept his aspirations to himself, thinking they were too far-fetched for someone like him. But Grace's sincerity made him feel safe enough to answer, though he had hesitated at first. "I'd build a library," he had finally said, looking down at his hands. "A place where kids like me can go to learn and dream. Books are expensive, and most of the kids here don't have them. I think it could change things." Grace's face had softened, her eyes shining with admiration. "That's a beautiful dream, Elijah, and I think it's worth chasing." Now, as the evening breeze played with the edges of his notebook, Elijah stared at the rough sketch he had drawn, a small building with rows of shelves and a space for children to sit and read. It was simple, but in his mind it held the promise of something much greater. Martha stepped out of the house, wiping her hands on her apron. She paused when she saw the intensity in Elijah's expression. "What's on your mind, child?" she asked, taking a seat beside him. Elijah hesitated for a moment before handing her the notebook. "I want to build this, Grandma," he said softly. "A library for the kids around here, a place where they can dream big." Martha's eyes scanned the sketch, and a small smile tugged at her lips. "You've always had a big heart, Elijah," she said, her voice filled with pride. "But dreams like this take more than just heart. They take resources and support." "I know," Elijah said, his determination unwavering, "but I can't stop thinking about it. Grace said she'd help. She believes in this idea." Martha nodded slowly. "If Grace Hayes says she'll help, then maybe this dream isn't as far off as it seems." The next morning, Grace arrived at Elijah's home with a car full of supplies, books, notebooks, and even a small bookshelf. "I thought we could start small," she said, her excitement infectious. "Maybe we can use your porch as a temporary library until we figure out something bigger." Elijah's eyes widened as he helped unload the car. Each book felt like a treasure, its potential weightier than anything he had ever imagined. The children from the community began to gather, their curiosity piqued by the sight of the books. Soon, the porch was buzzing with activity as Elijah read aloud to a group of younger kids. As the day went on, Grace and Elijah sat together, watching the children flip through the pages of their newfound treasures. "This is just the beginning," Grace said, her tone resolute. "We'll find a way to make your dream a reality." But not everyone shared their enthusiasm. Henry Hayes, who had been observing from the sidelines, was skeptical. "Grace," he said that evening as they returned to the mansion, "this is a noble idea, but it's not practical. You're giving that boy false hope." Grace's gaze was steady as she replied, "It's not false hope if we follow through. Follow. Elijah has something most people lack, vision, and I intend to help him see it through." Henry didn't respond, but her words lingered with him as he sat alone in his study later that night. He thought about the library, the children's smiles, and Elijah's unwavering determination. For the first time, he began to question whether he was the one who had been blinded by his own prejudices. Back at home, Elijah sat on his bed, the notebook open before him. He wrote the word library at the top of a blank page and began to list ideas, ways to fund it, materials they would need, and people who might help. As he worked, a quiet confidence settled over him. For the first time, his dream felt not just possible, but inevitable. The days that followed were filled with small victories. Grace helped Elijah organize book drives, and the community began to rally behind the idea. Children started showing up daily to borrow books, and even the adults began to take notice. The porch library became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even the smallest of dreams could spark something extraordinary. But Elijah knew there was still a long way to go. As he stood on the porch one evening, watching the last of the children leave with books tucked under their arms, he made a silent promise to himself. This was just the beginning. One day, the library would stand as a testament to what could be achieved with a little faith and a lot of determination. And he wouldn't stop until that day came. The morning sun filtered through the dense canopy of trees as Elijah and Grace stood outside the small, makeshift library on his grandmother's porch. The past few weeks had brought a whirlwind of changes. Bookshelves crammed with donations, children filling the yard with laughter and excitement, and neighbors dropping by to lend a hand. The dream was beginning to take shape, but Elijah knew it was far from complete. Grace, as always, was optimistic. "You've inspired something incredible, Elijah," she said, her voice warm. "But if we're going to turn this into a proper library, we'll need to think bigger." Elijah nodded, his determination as solid as ever. "I've been thinking about that," he replied. "There's an old lot near the creek. It's big enough for a building, and it's close to the community. If we could clear it, maybe." Grace smiled at his enthusiasm, but she knew the hurdles they faced. "It's a good idea, Elijah," she said gently, "but we'll need resources, permits, construction materials, funding. It's not impossible, but it's going to take more than just hard work." The two stood in silence for a moment, contemplating the challenge ahead. Just then, a sleek black car pulled up in front of the house, its polished surface gleaming in the sunlight. Henry Hayes stepped out, his expression unreadable. Elijah tensed, unsure of what to expect. Henry approached slowly, his hands in his pockets. "I've been hearing a lot about this project," he said, his tone measured. "Grace won't stop talking about it, and to be honest, I wanted to see it for myself." Elijah watched as Henry's eyes swept over the scene, the children flipping through books, the neighbors chatting, the shelves overflowing with stories waiting to be read. For a moment, the man's typically stern demeanor softened. "This," Henry said, gesturing to the bustling activity around them, "is impressive. But if you're serious about building a real library, you're going to need more than just donations and goodwill." Elijah squared his shoulders, meeting Henry's gaze head-on. "I know," he said, simply, "but I'm willing to do whatever it takes." Henry studied the boy, his sharp eyes searching for any sign of hesitation. When he found none, he nodded slightly. "All right," he said, "let's take a look at that lot you mentioned." The drive to the creek was quiet, the tension in the air palpable. When they arrived, Elijah led Henry and Grace to the overgrown patch of land he had envisioned for the library. The area was rough, filled with weeds and debris, but Elijah saw its potential. "This is it," he said, his voice steady. "It's not much now, but it could be something amazing." Henry walked the perimeter, his gaze thoughtful. He paused near the creek, the sound of rushing water filling the silence. Finally, he turned to face Elijah. "If you want my help," Henry said, his tone firm, "you'll have to prove that this isn't just a fleeting dream. I need to know that you're serious about this, that you're willing to put in the work no matter how hard it gets." Elijah didn't hesitate. "I am," he said. "This isn't just a dream, it's a promise." Henry studied him for a long moment before extending his hand. "Then let's get to work," he said. The following days were a blur of activity. Henry used his connections to secure the necessary permits, while Grace coordinated a fundraiser to cover the costs of clearing the land and laying the foundation. Elijah, true to his word, threw himself into the work, rallying the community to help with the cleanup. At first, Henry kept his distance, observing from the sidelines. But as the project gained momentum, he found himself drawn in. He began working alongside Elijah, their shared efforts slowly breaking down the barriers between them. For the first time, Henry saw the boy not just as a rescuer or a dreamer, but as a leader, someone who could inspire change. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Henry and Elijah stood together, surveying the cleared lot. The space was now ready for construction, a tangible reminder of what determination and collaboration could achieve. "You've got something special." "Elijah," Henry said, his voice quiet, "not just the library, but you. You've got a way of bringing people together." Elijah looked at him, his expression serious. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said, "or Grace, or the community. This isn't just my dream, it's ours." Henry nodded, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Ours," he agreed. As the first rays of dawn broke the next morning, the community gathered at the lot, ready to begin construction. The air buzzed with excitement and hope, each person eager to contribute to something that would outlast them all. For Elijah, it was a moment of profound gratitude. Standing amidst the crowd, he felt the weight of their collective belief in him, and in the dream they now shared. And as the first brick was laid, he knew that the library would be more than just a building. It would be a testament to what could be, achieved when people came together, united by a common purpose. The grand opening of the library was a day unlike any other the small community had ever seen. A crowd gathered in the morning light, the air electric with excitement. Children, parents, and elders from every corner of the town stood together, their faces glowing with anticipation. For so long, the lot by the creek had been nothing but an overgrown patch of land. Now it stood transformed, a gleaming new building, modest but full of life, its windows reflecting the hopes and dreams of all who had contributed to its creation. Elijah stood near the entrance, his heart pounding in his chest. He was dressed in the only suit he owned, a hand-me-down from a cousin that didn't quite fit, but to him it felt like armor. Beside him stood Grace and Henry Hayes, their presence a testament to how far they had all come. His grandmother Martha beamed with pride from the front row of the crowd, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. As the murmurs of the crowd quieted, Grace stepped forward to address them. She looked out at the sea of faces, her voice steady but filled with emotion. Today, we celebrate more than just the opening of a library. We celebrate the power of community, the strength of determination, and the courage of one young boy who dared to dream beyond his circumstances. Her words were met with applause, but she quickly held up her hand, gesturing toward Elijah. None of this would have been possible without Elijah. He saw the potential in this land, in this community, and in all of us. He reminded us that the greatest wealth lies not in what we have, but in what we share. And today, we honor him. Elijah's cheeks flushed as the crowd erupted into cheers. Grace handed him the scissors for the ribbon-cutting ceremony, and with a deep breath he stepped forward. The red ribbon stretched across the entrance seemed to symbolize more than just a barrier. It represented the obstacles he had overcome and the new possibilities that lay ahead. With a quick snip, the ribbon fell, and the crowd surged forward, eager to see the inside. The library was everything Elijah had imagined and more. Rows of shelves lined the walls, filled with books donated by the community and beyond. A small reading nook with colorful cushions invited children to sit and lose themselves in stories. The walls were painted with murals of the creek, the town, and a bright sky filled with possibilities. Children immediately began exploring, their laughter filling the space as they flipped through pages and whispered excitedly to one another. Parents and elders wandered the aisles, marveling at the transformation. Elijah watched it all unfold, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude. As the day went on, Henry approached Elijah, holding a small, leather-bound book in his hands. "I wanted you to have this," he said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "It belonged to my grandfather. He always believed in the power of education and community, just like you do." Elijah accepted the book reverently, opening it to find an inscription on the first page. "Knowledge is the seed of change. Plant it wisely." He looked up at Henry, his eyes brimming with emotion. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. By evening, as the crowd began to disperse, Elijah stood outside the library with Grace and Henry. The creek babbled gently in the background, its waters now calm, a stark contrast to the chaos of the day he had pulled Ethan from its depths. "This place," Grace said, her voice filled with wonder. "It's not just a library, it's a legacy, a testament to what happens when we believe in each other." Henry nodded, his usual sternness softened. "You've done something remarkable, Elijah, and it's just the beginning." Elijah looked at them, his heart full. "It wasn't just me," he said. "It was all of us. This library belongs to everyone." As the stars began to dot the night sky, Elijah walked back to his grandmother's house. The sound of the creek followed him, a gentle reminder of the day that had changed everything. He thought about how far he had come, from a boy fishing by the creek to a young man who had built something lasting for his community. And he thought about the future, about the children who would sit in the library and dream, just as he had. That night, as he lay in bed, the notebook that had held his sketches and ideas sat on the table beside him. He opened it one last time, flipping to a blank page. At the top, he wrote, "Next dream," and beneath it he began to jot down new ideas. The library was just the start. There was so much more he wanted to do, so many ways he wanted to give back. Elijah fell asleep with a smile on his face, the sound of the creek outside his window a soothing melody. And as the library stood tall by the water's edge, it became a beacon of hope, not just for the community, but for anyone who dared to believe that even the smallest acts of courage and kindness could ripple outwards, changing lives and shaping the future. What an emotional journey this story has been, don't you think? Here at Living Narratives, every video is crafted with care to touch your heart and bring meaningful reflections about life. If you believe in the power of stories that inspire and move, make sure to subscribe to our channel by doing so you help us continue creating heartfelt content like this one. Take a moment to explore our other videos. Each one carries messages that could transform your day. And let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? We love connecting with our audience and becoming part of your life. Thank you so much for your support, and we'll see you in the next story here on Living Narratives, where emotion and inspiration come together.